First piece of literature you're going to be reading for this course is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And after Frankenstein, we'll be reading some shorter stories. So I want to talk a little bit about what fiction is and some of the components that make it different from other types of literature. So fiction is a story, and it's usually a longer story that is told in unrhymed language, which is called prose. It usually uses realistic characters, so people that we recognize, characters that are not too unfamiliar or too alien, and it is set in some kind of a physical environment. And it is longer, so there's more room for a little bit more detail, whereas a short story or a poem might not have as much character development in it. So fiction is usually longer, told in ordinary language, and it has a setting. Something that I want you to start looking for as you begin to read Frankenstein is think about the mood that it creates. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is categorized as Gothic fiction, which has its own certain descriptions to it. And as you begin to read it, I think you'll start to get an idea of what those elements of tone are. So what kind of atmosphere is created as you begin to read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein? And you can start to see this through the way the characters think. So a lot of times we get in fiction a look into the inner workings of a character's mind. We get to hear how they think, how they're developing ideas, and what they want to say to other characters but might not say. We also see this, how they talk to each other and what they do or don't do to each other. So there's all these elements that combine to create this setting and this mood. And it's also expressed in things like weather, in where they are staying, what's happening around them, what kind of clothes are they wearing. So all of those combined pieces give us an idea of what kind of mood it's supposed to create. So as you start to read the first couple chapters of Frankenstein, ask yourself, where am I? What kind of surroundings am I, the reader, supposed to be imagining? And what kind of a mood am I feeling as I read the words on the page? It is also a way for us to determine the type of attitude that the author has toward the characters he or she is writing about, or the reader that he or she envisions. Now, some people write never really having an imagined audience in mind. They just have a story that they have to tell, while others might have a very definite idea of who they want this story to relate to. So think about, as you're reading, does it seem evident to you that Mary Shelley feels a certain way about societal issues or about people that she's describing? And you can start to recognize as you read the works of one author, let's say you take Margaret Atwood, who is the Handmaid's Tale author. I've read several of her works, and I start to see similar themes that are produced because of the way that she reveals characters. So start to ask yourself if you pick up on some of those similarities as you go chapter to chapter in what you think Mary Shelley is trying to say. So think about what the mood is as you read it. Now, the plot is essential in a work of fiction because there has to be something that happens. There has to be a problem that is overcome. Otherwise, we'd just be reading about a character sketch or about a setting. And so any type of fiction needs to have, whether big or small, some kind of blip in the radar, some kind of thing that the main character has to overcome or surmount. And there are several big events that happen in Frankenstein because there's several characters that develop, but ask yourself once you're done with it, what is the major story? What is the major piece of action that happens? If I were to have to describe this story to somebody else, what would I say is the succinct distillation of all the things that happen within the story? Then you have characterization. So who are the primary characters? And in longer pieces of fiction, you're going to have more fully developed characters, just like in longer pieces of film or series. You get more time to spend with who the characters are, how they think, how they dress, how they talk, how they eat, who they interact with. And so if you're looking at about a 200-page piece of fiction, we have some space to develop characters, but we don't have the space to really get to know them super intimately. So we're going to be dealing almost always in fiction with a protagonist, which is the person that we're rooting for. We might not always like everything about the protagonist, but we usually want that person to do well. And then you have the antagonist, or the bad guy, if you will. That is the person who might be causing trouble or is just not very likable, and we don't always want good things for that person. And then in fiction, you're going to have full round characters, so characters who we get to hear or see do more. And then the flatter characters are those extraneous characters that don't get as many lines, that don't get as much play. So remember who the author's paying the most attention to, who he or she is developing the most. Those would be our round characters. And start looking for who you think the protagonist is and who the antagonist is, because sometimes that's not always clear, and sometimes it can switch. Another important component of fiction is the setting where it takes place. Now in Frankenstein, you have actual geographic settings or physical locations, and these are going to change based on who's telling which part of the story. So we do have a voyager and adventurer in the story, so we begin one place and we move several other places, so pay attention to that. In what historical time are we talking about? Mary Shelley wrote this novel about 200 years ago, so things were different, cultural norms were different, gender and race roles and ideas were different. So think about how that is depicted in the story and how that's changed and how a modern reader reads that. And then also think about the social situation or the setting. That includes portrayals of class and who has what and what that means to the people in the story. What kind of family does Victor Frankenstein come from? What kind of family did Mary Shelley come from? And how does that affect the moral of the story, if you will? So as you begin to get into the first chapters, note that there will be changes in the setting and start to pay attention to things like, well, what was going on during this time and what kind of social class is being talked about and how is that important, if it's important. Another thing to consider is the point of view, who's telling the story. So when we tell a story in first person, I, me, my, it automatically brings the reader closer because we start to speak in the narrator's voice. We become, if you will, the main character. When we tell a story in second person, which is very rare in fiction, it puts distance. It's more used for things like instruction manuals and process pieces. And then third person is he, she, they, them, their story. And that creates distance between the reader and the narrator. And there's advantages to both first and third person, but usually if it's first person, we're going to become a little bit more empathetic to the main characters. You also have narrators who might not be the main characters in the story, so you have the person who's talking who knows what's going on and knows everything about all the characters, versus you have the limited, omniscient narrator who only knows about one character. So think about this often as portrayed in plays. You have a narrator or a voiceover who's kind of telling you what's going on in the mind of the main character, whereas we might not see it in the other people that he or she interacts with. Then in fiction, you also have a sense of irony. And when we're talking about irony, we can talk about what we know because we're exposed to what other characters are doing and thinking versus what the main characters might not know. Irony can also be expressed in uses of figurative language like similes and metaphors. And we use these styles of language to make things more explicit and more concrete, but we also do it to make things more abstract and complicated. So note the types of language that the author uses. You will start to pick up, I know I did, that Mary Shelley really likes the word wretched. So begin to count the number of times that she uses that word and why is that word important. Then you have themes, and this goes back to what is this story trying to tell us? What is the lesson that we can take away about the human condition? What does it mean to be human? And that is a lot of times what fiction is dealing with. So there are often a lot of different themes that can be portrayed in a piece of fiction, and there are several that you might start to pick up on in Frankenstein, and I'll start to ask you guys to share some of those thoughts in group discussions. And then finally, some of these questions on this slide can help you start to think about how you want to analyze pieces of fiction. And these are questions that you can always come back to that will work with any type of fiction that you're reading. So tone, plot, main characters, the setting, the point of view, the themes. Are there ambiguities? Are there things that are left out? Does it conflict with your own position politically, morally? When was the piece written? Is that important? If so, how? And can you connect this story to any other stories that you've read? So those are some things to think about as you begin to read Frankenstein. Enjoy.